The wall clock ticked, each beat pounding against Eleanor Brooks's chest. The little house in the Oregon town lay steeped in late afternoon light, the air thick with the scent of old wood and the dust of forgotten papers. She had grown used to this silence since Richard, her husband of 40 years, had died suddenly of a heart attack. Today, she gathered what courage she had left to finally clean out his filing cabinet. One drawer after another slid open. Tax records, insurance policies, property deeds, all placed neatly on the table. They were fragments of a life the two of them had built together, carved out of sweat, sacrifice, and quiet loyalty. But when her hand reached the bottom drawer, something felt wrong. A panel of wood didn't sit flush. Eleanor froze, her heart kicked harder. She pushed, and a hidden compartment revealed itself. Inside, buried beneath dust, was a small metal box, its lock rusted but intact. Eleanor brushed her fingertips across its surface, her hands trembling. An unnamed fear stirred inside her chest. In all their years together, Richard had never once mentioned such a box. Tucked between the stacks of papers, she found a tiny key. Eleanor drew a deep breath, slid it into the lock. A sharp click rang out in the silence. The lid creaked open, exposing a folded document inside. Her eyes locked on the first line. A birth certificate. Father, Richard Brooks. Mother, Ruth. Not her. Eleanor went still. The paper shook violently in her grip, as if ready to fall from her hands. Each letter carved itself into her heart like a blade. 40 years of raising the boy she had loved with every piece of herself, and he was not her son by blood. Her body collapsed into the chair, her gaze empty, hollow. The ticking clock now clanged, mocking, relentless, pounding away at the trust she had carried her whole life. Then, from beneath the papers, an old yellow envelope slipped out. On its surface, written in a hand she knew too well. For Ellie, if the day ever comes. Her fingers traced the letters, her vision blurred with tears. Richard's handwriting. The hand of the man who had held her at the altar, whispered, "I love you" on winter nights, and carried her through decades of shared years. Now, from the grave, he had left behind a truth that could shatter her. Her voice broke into a whisper, raw and trembling. 40 years of love, and a secret you took to the grave. The room was utterly still. Only the sound of her heartbeat remained, fast, uneven, suffocating, as though warning her that the world she knew had already collapsed. Eleanor sat there for what felt like hours, the birth certificate spread across her lap, the envelope heavy in her palm. Her mind refused to line up the facts. Each memory she reached for cracked under the weight of this paper. The laughter in the kitchen, the scraped knees she'd bandaged, the graduation gown she'd ironed with care. Suddenly, every moment felt stolen, borrowed from a story that had never been hers. Her throat closed as she ripped open the yellow envelope. Inside was a single page, folded with the kind of precision Richard always used when he wanted something to look proper. Her breath caught as her eyes traced the handwriting. "Ellie," it began. "If you're reading this, then I'm no longer there to explain myself. I need you to know the truth. Long before I met you, before the war ended, there was someone else. Her name was Ruth. We were young, foolish, and for a time I believed we'd build a life together. Then she was gone, taken from this world too soon, leaving behind our son. I couldn't bear the thought of him lost, alone, so I brought him home. To you, to us. I told myself that if I raised him as ours, it would be enough. That love would be stronger than truth. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted you to feel less than the mother you are." The page blurred as Eleanor's tears fell, darkening the ink. Her chest tightened, her breath shallow. She pressed the letter to her chest as though she could still feel Richard's warmth through the paper, but the words burned. Not hers, not her son. She stumbled back against the cabinet, sliding to the floor, her back pressed to the wood. The silence around her felt suffocating, pressing in from every wall. For 40 years she had lived inside a marriage she believed unbreakable, a family she believed unshakable. And now, with one piece of paper, one letter, it had all been rewritten. Her hands clutched at her knees as sobs broke loose from her chest. It wasn't anger yet, it was grief. Grief for the man she thought she knew, grief for the truth withheld, grief for the mother she had believed herself to be. The clock kept ticking, indifferent. The house that had once felt like sanctuary now echoed like a stranger's hollow shell. And somewhere in her heart, one thought screamed louder than the rest. If her entire life had been built on a lie, then what did that make her son? What would this truth do to him? The question hung heavy in the dim light, heavier than the grief in her chest, heavier than the secret her husband had carried to his grave. The letter slipped from Eleanor's lap, drifting onto the carpet like a leaf torn free in autumn. She pressed her palms to her face, but memories wouldn't stay buried. They rose, one after another, forcing her to look again at a life she thought she understood. She was 29 again, standing in her mother's parlor in a lace dress, the hem brushing her ankles. Richard, tall in his uniform, had slipped the ring on her finger with a smile that trembled at the edges. She remembered leaning into his shoulder, thinking he looked nervous only because of the crowd. Now she wondered, was it nerves, or was it the weight of a secret he'd already chosen to keep? Another memory. Their first winter as husband and wife. The snow piled high against the porch rails, and Richard had stoked the fire until the room glowed. She had asked him playfully about his younger years, about the people he'd known before the war. He had looked at her for a long time, then smiled that practiced smile. "Let the past stay buried, Ellie," he'd said. And she had laughed, kissed his cheek, and let the answer stand. Her breath shuddered as she thought back to the day an envelope arrived with a postmark from another state, one she couldn't recall now. She'd asked about it, but Richard had stiffened, his jaw locked. "Junk," he muttered, sliding it into his coat pocket before she could see. She remembered the sharpness in his tone, the way his hand shook just slightly as he tucked the letter away. She'd never asked again. The images came faster. Richard pacing the kitchen after midnight, his shoulders hunched. Richard watching their son sleep with an intensity that seemed to ache. Richard falling silent whenever someone mentioned adoption, as though the word itself burned. Each memory, once tender, now cut like glass. Eleanor gripped the arm of the chair to steady herself. She had built her marriage on trust, on faith in a man who had promised her forever. And he had given her forever, yes, but one shadowed by a lie so profound it now rewrote every smile, every quiet Sunday morning, every whispered, "I love you." She whispered into the empty room, her voice cracked and raw. "How could you let me love you without the truth? How could you let me be a mother without knowing?" The clock answered with another tick, each beat a reminder that time moves forward, but memory can twist back, reshaping the past until it's unrecognizable. And for Eleanor, every remembered joy now carried a hollow echo. By morning, the storm of tears had dried to a dull ache behind Eleanor's eyes. She sat at the kitchen table with the envelope and birth certificate spread before her like evidence in a trial she had never asked to attend. The coffee in her cup had gone cold hours ago, untouched. Grief had kept her paralyzed through the night, but dawn brought something else, an edge of steel she hadn't felt in years. If Richard had chosen silence, she would not. She refused to live out her days, chained to half-truths and shadows. She slid the papers into a folder, her hands steadier than she expected, and called a name she hadn't spoken aloud in decades. Michael Frazier, a local attorney who had once handled the sale of her family's farm. He answered with the same patient tone she remembered. "Eleanor Brooks, it's been a long time." Her voice trembled at first, then firmed. "Michael, I need your help. It's about my husband, about something he left behind." By afternoon, she sat in his office, the blinds casting striped shadows across oak shelves heavy with law books. Michael adjusted his glasses, scanning the documents she placed before him. He read slowly, lips pressed thin. When he finally looked up, His eyes carried the weight of both pity and concern. "This isn't just a secret, Eleanor," he said softly. "This is a missing piece of a legal record. If your husband bypassed proper adoption filings, it means your entire family history was built on paperwork that doesn't exist." The words stung, but Eleanor only nodded. "Then we find it, all of it." Michael tapped the birth certificate, his finger firm. "This name, Ruth. If we can trace her, we'll find the truth." That night, Eleanor sat hunched over the glow of her desk lamp, combing through county records, newspaper archives, and faded yearbooks her lawyer's assistant had dug up. Each lead was a thread, fragile but real, and slowly a picture began to form. Ruth had been Richard's first love, a woman from another state, a place he had never spoken of. They had a child together, a son. When Ruth died young, Richard had taken the boy, crossing state lines and beginning again under a different story. A forged guardianship here, a doctored form there. Enough to make it all look seamless. Enough to fool even Eleanor, the woman who shared his bed for 40 years. Eleanor pushed the papers away, her hands trembling. She whispered into the lamplight as though Richard sat across from her still. "You brought him to me and you let me love him, but you never gave me the truth." The clock on the mantel chimed midnight. She sat straighter, shoulders squared. For the first time since opening the box, she felt clarity. Her marriage might have been a lie, but her motherhood wasn't, and she would prove it. The phone felt heavier than it should. Eleanor stared at the digits on the screen, her thumb hovering. She had rehearsed the words 100 ways, but none of them softened the blow. There was no gentle way to tell a child, even a grown man, that his life was built on a lie. When her son finally answered, his voice was warm, casual. "Hey, Mom, you all right? You sound off." The word Mom nearly broke her. She pressed her palm to her chest, steadying her breath. "Could you come by the house, sweetheart? There's something I need to tell you, something important." He arrived that evening, his tie loosened from a long day at the office. The sight of him standing in the doorway, tall, confident, every bit the man she'd raised, nearly undid her resolve. But the folder lay waiting on the kitchen table, and truth had already been set loose. They sat across from each other. Eleanor folded her hands to stop them from trembling. "There's no easy way to say this," she began, her voice low but steady. "I found something in your father's things, something about where you came from." He frowned, leaning forward. "What do you mean?" Her fingers brushed the edge of the birth certificate. She slid it toward him, the paper whispering across the table. He picked it up, scanning the lines, confusion knitting into disbelief. His lips moved as he read aloud, barely a whisper. "Father Richard Brooks, Mother Ruth." His eyes lifted, wide and searching. "Mom, who's Ruth?" Eleanor's chest clenched. She reached across the table, gripping his hand. "She was your father's before me. She died, and he brought you home. He told me you were mine, and I believed it for 40 years because in my heart you were." The paper slipped from his fingers, his voice cracked, raw and trembling. "So all this time I wasn't really your son." Her throat ached, but she forced the words out, firm and unshaken. "No, don't you dare say that. You are my son. Every scraped knee, every bedtime story, every sacrifice I ever made, they were for you. Not because of blood, because you are mine." His face broke and tears streaked down his cheeks. He covered his eyes, shaking, then leaned into her arms like he had as a boy. Eleanor held him, her hand stroking his hair, her heart breaking and healing all at once. For a long time they sat in silence, their grief mingling. Two lives scarred by the same lie, clinging to the one truth that mattered. Love had made them mother and son, and no secret could erase it. Eleanor closed her eyes, pressing her cheek against his temple. "I just wish," she whispered, "that your father had trusted us with the truth. We could have carried it together." The house was quiet but no longer hollow. For the first time since she'd opened that box, Eleanor felt something like strength return to her chest. The lie had wounded them both, but love had survived it. Word spread fast in families like theirs. By the end of the week, Cousins and in-laws Eleanor hadn't seen in years gathered in her living room, their voices sharp as knives. The house that once held Christmas carols and Sunday suppers now rang with accusation. One nephew leaned forward, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "Look, Eleanor, we all know you meant well, but the truth is you were never really his mother, not by blood. That changes things." Another cousin chimed in, waving a hand toward the birth certificate spread on the table. "Exactly. If Ruth was the real mother, then inheritance is complicated. Richard didn't make it clear in his will. We have a right to what's fair." Their words fell like stones, each one meant to bury her deeper. But Eleanor did not flinch. She sat tall in her chair, her silver hair catching the light from the chandelier, her son at her side. Her voice, when it came, was calm, steady as a gavel. "You think blood makes a mother? You think paperwork decides love? Then you never understood this family. Richard may have kept his secrets, but he left no doubt about one thing." She reached into her folder, sliding an envelope across the table. The wax seal was still unbroken, her husband's handwriting clear on the front, to be opened in Ellie's keeping. Gasps rippled as she broke the seal and unfolded the letter. Her eyes scanned the words once more before she read aloud, her voice carrying through the room like judgment. "Ellie was the only mother he ever had. Everything I own belongs to her and to our son, both of them together." The room stilled. Even the clock on the wall seemed to pause. Eleanor lifted her gaze, her expression carved from stone. "You came here thinking you could rewrite my husband's wishes, but here is his voice, his words, his truth, and no court in the state will stand against it." Michael Frazier, her attorney, stepped forward from the doorway where he'd been quietly watching. His tone was clipped, professional, final. "The documents are valid. Richard Brooks's estate belongs solely to Mrs. Brooks and her son. Legally, there is no dispute." The fight drained from the room. Faces hardened into silence, a few lips pressed thin in defeat. One cousin muttered under his breath, but no one else spoke. Chairs scraped back, footsteps shuffled toward the door. The would-be challengers filed out, their arguments dissolved into shame. Eleanor sat still, the letter trembling slightly in her hands, but her voice, when she whispered to her son, was steady. "Your father's lies hurt us, but he left us this, too, the truth of who we are and what belongs to us." Her son reached for her hand, squeezing it tight, and in that moment, Eleanor realized the legacy Richard left behind wasn't the house or the land or the bank accounts. It was this bond, tested by fire, unbroken by blood. By the time the last relative's car pulled out of the driveway, silence returned to the house. But it wasn't the same silence that had haunted Eleanor since Richard's death. This silence was earned. It was the kind that follows a storm, heavy but clean. Her attorney gathered the papers into a neat stack, his voice steady but gentle. "Legally, everything is in order. They can huff and puff, but the will is airtight. You and your son are secure, Eleanor." She nodded, her hands folded over the envelope Richard had left. Secure. It was a word that should have comforted her. Instead, it felt like a bandage placed over a wound still bleeding underneath. Her son sat beside her, his face pale but determined. He stared at the floor for a long time before speaking. "Mom, I don't know who I am anymore, but I know who you are. You raised me. You're my mother. Nothing they say changes that." Her eyes filled, but this time the tears did not sting. She reached across, took his hand, and held it firmly. "You're mine," she whispered. "Not because of blood, because of everything we've lived, because love makes a family stronger than any secret." The words steadied them both. In the days that followed, the house began to breathe again. Eleanor sorted through Richard's belongings piece by piece, but now with clarity. She did not curse him, though the betrayal cut deep. Instead, she carried his words with her. Ellie was the only mother he ever had. That truth, though late, was hers to keep. One afternoon, she and her son sat together at the kitchen table, fresh papers spread out before them. Together they drafted a new will, clear, simple, unshakable. This time there would be no secrets, no shadows, no disputes left behind for others to exploit. As she signed her name, Eleanor felt a quiet power stir within her. She had been lied to, betrayed, almost stripped of the life she built, but she had stood her ground. Justice had been restored, not in fury, but in silence, in patience, in truth. That night she stepped out onto the porch, the cool Oregon air brushing against her cheeks. She tilted her head toward the stars. "Lies do not die with the liar," she murmured. "They live on in the ones left behind, but so does love, and I choose love." Behind her, the warm glow of the kitchen light spilled onto the porch. Her son moved about inside, humming softly, the way Richard once had. For the first time in weeks, Eleanor felt something she thought she'd lost forever: peace. The sky was soft with spring light, the kind that made even grief seem less jagged. In the garden behind the Brooks house, the soil was dark and freshly turned. Eleanor stood with her son at her side, a small sapling between them. Its roots dangled like fragile threads of hope, ready to take hold. They worked in silence, the only sounds the scrape of the shovel, the breath of wind, the steady rhythm of earth being moved. When the hole was ready, Eleanor knelt, lowering the tree into the ground as though placing a newborn into a cradle. Her son steadied the trunk while she covered the roots, pressing the soil firmly, her palms streaked with dirt. Beside them, the headstone caught the light, Richard's name carved deep, unchanging. Eleanor touched it briefly, not in anger, but in something closer to farewell. "You kept your secret too long," she whispered. "But you gave me a son, and I will not let that gift be poisoned." Her son placed a small wooden plaque at the base of the tree. 3 words, carved by his own hand, glowed in the sun. Truth, love, legacy. Eleanor traced the letters with her fingertips, then leaned back to look at the sapling swaying in the breeze. It would take years to grow tall, but that was all right. She had learned patience. She had lived it. Her son slipped his arm around her shoulders. Together they stood, watching the young tree stretch toward the sky. In the hush of the garden, Eleanor's voice rose, steady and clear, as if speaking to Richard, to herself, to the years yet to come. "He hid a secret for 40 years, but when it surfaced, I didn't lose a husband. I gained the truth and a son who chose to stand with me." The wind stirred, carrying the words upward, past the roof of the old house, past the clouds that drifted slow and steady until they belonged to the sky. And for the first time in a long time, Eleanor smiled.